Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing another Sharks player review, and today it will be Jacob Middleton, actually the first player in my reviews who is not actually still a San Jose Sharks, was traded at the trade deadline to the Minnesota Wild in exchange, amongst other things, for goaltender Kaapo Kähkönen. And so I think this is as perfect time as any to remind people what exactly are these sort of evaluations that I'm making here, because it is not actually just who is the best player on the San Jose Sharks this past season, because if it were just that, it would just be every single year being players like Meier and Karlsson and Burns and Couture and Hertl all the way at the top, and it wouldn't really make for that interesting of a list. So actually these gradings are based, each individual player, on their respective preseason expectations. And so this makes it so that, for instance, last year, Timo Meier was the lowest ranked player by me on the entire Sharks team. And so a player like John Leonard was ahead of him in those rankings. Does that mean that John Leonard was a better player than Timo Meier? Absolutely not. Obviously, Meier was still better than Leonard, but it meant that based on what I was expecting from them, Meier was the most disappointing. And so that brings us here to Jacob Middleton, where the grading had to be changed slightly, because if it was indeed based on preseason expectations, on my opinion, then I would have had to give Middleton an A+++, because I came into this season with no expectations of anything from Jacob Middleton, and not the same type of no expectations as I come into a season with for certain, let's say, rookies, right? For a player like Thomas Bordeleau, I'm not necessarily expecting him to be a world beater or anything of that nature, and so I'm always pleasantly surprised if they actually managed to do something. No. The no expectations that I was coming to this season for Jacob Middleton with were actually extremely negative, because Middleton had played 14 career games spread over 3 distinct seasons prior to this past year, and in each of those games, or almost every single one of those games, I was extremely disappointed with his performance. Coming into this year, I was hopeful that the San Jose Sharks would play Middleton a grand total of 0 games on the season, and I was actually very disappointed that the Sharks even extended his contract this past off season, because like I said, he was just so bad in the 14 games he played prior to this year. He played 3 in 18-19, he played 10 in 19-20, and he played just a single game in 2021. And usually, Middleton was filling in as like a 7th or 8th defenseman. Usually when it comes to a defenseman like that, especially on a team like the San Jose Sharks, who have players like Burns and Karlsson eating up huge minutes per game, you're not necessarily expected to play even in the double digits in terms of minutes. And when it came to Middleton, when it comes to a 7th or 8th defenseman, you're just kind of hoping that when they're inevitably playing in the defensive zone, they're able to flip pucks out of the zone without taking an icing. They're able to make a short pass to their wingers who are going to be carrying it out of the zone, and just generally they don't get scored on. You're not expecting them to play a ton of time in the offensive zone. You're barely even expecting them to take any shots on net. You just need 7 or 8 minutes per game where they're not letting in or not making terrible plays and leaving their goaltender out to dry. But that's exactly what Middleton kept doing. Tons of giveaways, tons of poor reads. It felt as though even in games where he played less than 5 minutes, which I believe actually happened once in those 14 games that he played prior to this season, he was making even more than just one crucial error, and it was just terrible to watch. So coming into this season, we took a look at the Sharks defensive core, and it seemed as though the top 4 could be Burns Ferraro and Karlsson Knyzhov, and then in that bottom pairing it would be something like Vlasic Shemek with maybe like a Ryan Merkley or a Santeri Hatakka or whoever flexing into that particular bottom pairing, and then the 7th and 8th defenseman would be the other ones, as well as a player like Nick Milosh. I didn't think Middleton, and I hoped that Middleton would come nowhere near touching the Sharks' main roster this season. But in the end, it seems as though he actually had a relatively impressive preseason, and because of the injury to Knyzhov and all of those things, he actually iced in the first game of the season. And I remember watching and coming to the end of that first game and leaving myself extremely surprised by how actually solid Middleton looked in that game. And it was such a stark contrast from his games in the previous 3 seasons, the few games that he played, that it wasn't just that first game that left me surprised, but it was pretty much every single game after that for the next 2 weeks, for the first 2 weeks of the season, where I was like, wow, I'm expecting Middleton to fall back down to earth and where he was previously, but he keep sustaining an actually solid top 4 position, and it was just extremely impressive to watch how he somehow managed to jump from being that awful 7th or 8th defenseman to being an actual quite serviceable top 4 defenseman, because Middleton isn't necessarily all that young. He's not really old, but he is 26 years of age. So when it comes to, let's say, a defenseman who is 19 years old, for instance, and then they play poorly, and then the next year at 20 years old, they ended up looking pretty good, that's kind of the expected progression of a player. But Middleton, especially since those were 3 seasons, 18, 19, 19, 20, and 2021, where in the very few games he actually played, he was just awful. You were not expecting such a massive jump of performance going into this year, and yet it kind of happened. So he ended up building up a ton of value for himself, and like I said, that ended up earning him a trade to the Minnesota Wild for a chance to actually compete in the playoffs. And while the Wild were unfortunately eliminated in the first round, so Middleton won't get that didn't get that opportunity of going super far in the playoffs, he is still a restricted free agent with the Minnesota Wild, so it is likely he will at the very least be there for another season, and I doubt the Wild's playoff chances are really dropping anytime soon with the young and strong team that they have there. And so generally, moving on to the stats for Jacob Middleton, we have 45 games played, 3 goals, 6 assists for 9 points, but obviously, like is the case for all defensive defensemen, it is really not the point stat that actually matter for him. And what's more interesting is the other 2 stats here I have on the board, in particular the plus minus, where he sits with a +3, which is incredibly impressive. As you'll know with the previous reviews that I've made of the Sharks' top 3 forwards, Couture, Hurdle, and Meyer, each of those forwards were in the minus. And I specifically mentioned that just team-wide is going to be a trend towards the minus side of things because of the fact that the team is just not good and is letting in more goals than they are actually scoring. So it's not a surprise if a player is a minus, and as long as they're not a heavy minus, it means they did pretty good. But Jacob Middleton, by the way, a player who was playing frequently with Brent Burns and Erik Karlsson, who were both minus players, Jacob Middleton ended up being not a minus, not a low minus or anything like that, like not a -2, but he was in the positives at a +3, incredibly impressive for a defensive defenseman who's not necessarily going to be setting up a lot of offensive plays for himself. So generally, that was a huge plus, no pun intended, for him. And when it comes to the time on ice, 19 minutes and 3 seconds, which is also quite solid on a team with such, like I mentioned earlier, big minute eaters in Brent Burns and Erik Karlsson. You also have to take into account the fact that Middleton does not play any time on the power play, and so that's a good 6 to 10 minutes per game that Middleton is just not going to be on the ice at all. And so 19 minutes and 3 seconds, technically 5th in terms of defensemen, but he is basically tied with Jacob Megna for 4th, and both Megna and Middleton filled a very similar role and didn't actually play a lot of games in the lineup at the same time. It was the Sharks dealt with a lot of defensive injuries, and then of course Middleton ended up getting traded at the trade deadline, and so Megna ended up being that guy in those last 20 or something games of the season. So basically Middleton was pretty much 4th on the team defensively, which does make sense, like I said, being behind Burns and Karlsson as well as Mario Ferraro. And so when it comes to the grading, like I mentioned earlier, if I was going strictly off of preseason expectations, I would have obviously given Jacob Middleton an A+++++, but I felt like that was not a very good reflection on exactly what was the case with the San Jose Sharks team this season. So I decided instead to base it on if he was just a rookie coming in with a completely clean slate. I knew nothing about this player coming in, and as such, I gave him the grade of a B. Class dismissed.